I think, of course, of Trump as a narcissist, self-aggrandizer. I think of most of the current leaders of Europe as cowards, quite frankly. Europe doesn't seem to realize that it is a powerful entity on the world stage.
Welcome back to The Focus. I'm John Bruni. In an era defined by rising authoritarianism, endless war, moral confusion, and political fatigue, people are searching, some desperately, for frameworks that can help them make sense of the chaos. One of these frameworks is Stoicism. But does this ancient Greco-Roman philosophy really have anything to offer a modern world on fire? Joining me today is someone who believes it does. Professor Massimo Pigliucci is a philosopher, biologist, author, and one of the world's leading public intellectuals on modern Stoicism. Massimo, welcome back to The Focus.
It's a pleasure to be back. Thanks for having me.
Before we dive in, tell us a little about your journey. How did a scientist like yourself come to embrace Stoic philosophy?
Yeah, good question, because my training is definitely not in ancient philosophy. I was an evolutionary biologist before moving to philosophy. But even within philosophy, my professional interest is in philosophy of science and understanding the difference between science and pseudoscience. So Stoicism was pretty far out there. And in fact, it was not on my mind until, of course, at some point, midlife crisis hit. And, I got a few things going on at the personal level and at professional level. This was a number of years ago, that all of a sudden I just did not know exactly how to deal with. There was no overall framework that was going to help me with things like a divorce or my father dying, things like that. Now, these are things that happen to lots of people, so there's nothing particularly tragic and particularly surprising about it. But nevertheless, when it happens to you, you kind of need to figure out your way out there and navigating the situation in the best possible way. And in my case, I grew up Catholic, but I left the church when I was a teenager, so that was not an option. That kind of comfort and that kind of structure was not there for me. I had always considered myself a secular humanist, and I still do in a sense. I mean, I like the general ideas upon which secular humanism is formed, the use of science and reason in order to tackle problems, human rights and all that sort of stuff. But that kind of general stuff doesn't really help very much with specific problems once that life sort of hits you with things. And so I decided, okay, well, I'm a philosopher, so surely philosophy is, in part at least, the point of philosophy. After all, the word does mean love of wisdom. So some part of the philosophy must be to help people through these kind of situations. And so I started searching more or less systematically. I looked at a number of practical philosophies of life, beginning with Buddhism, actually. So I actually started with the Eastern traditions. That's because a number of friends told me, that might resonate with you. It might be interesting. To make a long story short, I studied and did a little bit of practice of Buddhism, and then I eventually moved to the Greco-Roman tradition, particularly Aristotle, and then Epictetus. But none of those really clicked. It seemed like, yeah, they were certainly offering something, and that something was valuable. But at the same time, there were lots of issues that I couldn't, wrap my mind around. For instance, in the case of Buddhism, I really couldn't accept the underlying metaphysics, things like karma, reincarnation, and stuff like that. In the case of Aristotle, it was way too dry and really not resonating in any kind of level other than the purely intellectual one, and so on and so forth. And then one day, I saw this tweet. At the time it was on Twitter, what it's now called X, and the tweet said, "Help us celebrate Stoic Week." I thought, the hell is Stoic Week, and why would anybody want to celebrate the Stoics? But I was curious. I remember that Stoicism was a kind of virtue ethics. It is certainly considered a practical philosophy. So I said, well, what I got to lose? let's sign up for Stoic Week. And here we are now, more than a decade later, still talking about it.
Interesting. I mean, honestly, I've been fascinated by all things Stoic for quite some time, and I mean, I understand part of the journey that you've gone through because I've gone through something similar myself, and obviously in that sort of journey of life, you're always looking for something to hold on to, especially when you're constantly challenged at a personal level. So, look, yes, I can honestly say I agree with a lot of what you've just said, and I understand where you're coming from. So, anyway, let's get stuck into the geopolitics of Stoicism, shall we?
Sure.
Let's start with the emotional state of the modern world. Massimo, you've said Stoicism is about managing emotions, not erasing them. But when
Right.
outrage seems like the only sane reaction to war crimes, climate collapse, political extremism, what is the value of keeping your cool?
Well, the Stoics would argue that outrage is not, in fact, the only way or the best way to deal with those kind of situations. And in fact, the Stoics would argue that outrage is, which leads to anger, or it's based on anger, is actually self-defeating in the long run. Now, it's completely understandable. I mean, I have a hard time myself not being angry or outraged at all sorts of things that are happening right now in the world, not just in the United States here where I live. But at the same time, the Stoics would argue is like, look, we know that reacting to things on the basis of anger often leads to the wrong reaction. It leads to either overreact or react in a way that it's not rational, that it's not based on facts and evidence. It's not effective. Yeah, it might feel good in the moment. It may even be motivating in the moment. But if we're talking about a long-term strategy as opposed to just an in-the-moment reaction, that might not be the best way to go. So what the Stoics say is like what you need to cultivate is one of the four cardinal virtues, particularly the virtue of justice. So the Stoics believe that there are four fundamental character traits or cardinal virtues that we ought to constantly work on and improve throughout our lives to become better human beings, which is the ultimate goal of the Stoic philosophy. These cardinal virtues are practical wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Now, justice is one of them. Justice doesn't mean the Stoics did not develop a overarching theory of social justice, as we would call it today. Justice for the Stoics was simply treating other people fairly, humanely, with respect, in the way in which you would want to be treated. And that's more than a good enough, I think, starting point if we're talking about justice, because if you don't do that, if you don't believe in that, then there is no point in talking about more comprehensive theories of, universal theories of justice. Now, to be just also takes courage. So that's the second. That's the second cardinal virtue, because it will turn out that sooner or later you will have to do things in order to pursue justice that will take courage, in the sense of it will take, you'll do things that might actually come back and bite you. You might have to pay a price for acting justly toward the people, either in terms of reputation or in terms of, even physical things. Physical danger is something that most of us, fortunately, don't have to face. But it might come to even to that point. But you might feel, the response of other people, your friends, your family might not like what you're saying and what you're doing. Your boss might not like it, or you might lose your job. So it takes courage to pursue justice in the face of a world that is largely unjust. So that's two out of the four cardinal virtues. Now, the other two also come into play. Temperance means doing things in the right measure, right? Neither too much nor too little. So that's why Stoics don't want to get angry, because anger tends to bring you to do things in a way that it's not, in fact, measured. And doing things in a measured fashion, according to the Stoics, and in fact, according to modern psychology, is often the most efficacious thing. You don't get a lot out of just attacking people constantly. You get much further if you can actually navigate complex situations in a way that makes sense, in a way that it's productive, in a way that forms alliances with other people, collaboration with other people. So that's 3 out of 4. The fourth virtue is practical wisdom, and practical wisdom has to do with the knowledge of good and evil. In other words, with the knowledge of what is actually good and the knowledge of what is not actually good. Not what other people tell you it's good or not, but what actually is according to your own light of reasoning, according to the best evidence and the best thinking that you can muster. So all four of the virtues are necessary in order to act justly in the world, and that's the goal. That's how a Stoic would react. After all, as you know, one of the Stoic fundamental principles is that we should focus our attention on what is up to us, meaning in what is within the purview, within our agency, right? To start wondering about things about which you cannot do anything at all, not only doesn't do anything useful, but in fact is counterproductive, because then you get frustrated, you get discouraged. For instance, one of the first things that I did years ago was to greatly diminish my readings of in the moment news. I like to be generally up to date with what's happening in the world, but I have friends, well-intentioned friends, who constantly scroll through their screens or read the New York Times or listen to National Public Radio constantly. And sure enough, they're among the most depressed people that I know.
Yes, yes. Well, you raise a number of really interesting points here, but then again, I look at Stoicism as the ancient Greco-Roman philosophy, and I say to myself, well, just having heard what you've said, justice. If you look at the United States political system right now, one could say that the notion of justice, I mean, if you think that leaders ought to lead and set the example, what do you think we're starting to see out of the United States now? And what should average Americans think about the system? I mean, well, let's take the Epstein situation as an extreme example, right?
Yeah, I've heard of
So,
it. Yeah.
right, okay, yeah, yeah. I think we all have. But now we've got President Trump saying, and dare I say, it's all BS. It was a Democrat hoax. And
Right.
then you've got half of the MAGA base, saying, no, there is something that needs to be dug up here, and we want to know the truth. So
Right.
again, when you've got an American president who tends to, I don't know, maneuver his way into a situation where if people are looking for justice on a situation, he's obfuscating, he's doing whatever he can to look at me over here, don't look at this thing over there. I mean, that obviously sets an example for the individual to run their life, right? More
Yep.
so than the self-discipline necessary to say, look, that may be him, and I'm not taking his cues, even though he's the US president. How does
Right.
one separate the environment and focus on themselves as aware individuals in this sort of society?
Well, I think first of all, as you were mentioning a minute ago, one needs to step back and uh, ask themselves, what kind of society is the one in which I'm living in at the moment? Now, the United States, of course, most Americans will tell you it's a democracy. It's not. It hasn't been a democracy for quite some time. It has become an oligarchy. It has become controlled by a very small number of very powerful and very rich people. And I'm not just talking about Trump, Elon Musk, and so on and so forth. Those, in my mind, are the end result, or in some sense, the symptoms of the malaise. But the disease runs much deeper, unfortunately, than those people or the current situation. You can argue that too much money flooded into politics is always a bad idea, and that the United States has been the worst in that sense among the Western democracies for quite some time. But really, the tipping point was a series of decisions by the Supreme Court, in particular in 2010, the Citizens United decision, which essentially opened the floodgates to uncontrollable amount of money from very few select sources, so to speak. After that point, whatever was left of American democracy has gone down the drain. We do not live in a democracy. We live in a oligarchy that kind of pretends to be a democracy. I mean, you can see, of course, one of the results right now with the president instructing his party to literally cheat, openly cheat, in preparation of the next elections, right? There are the Texans Republicans first, and then apparently another 4 or 5 states are ready to follow suit, who are taking the extraordinary step of redistricting, redesigning the districts mid-cycle. Typically, that process is done after every census, every 10 years. You could argue, in fact, a lot of political scientists have argued that the way it's been done for a while is unethical, if not unconstitutional. This whole idea of gerrymandering, this whole idea that you carve up your districts in a way that maximizes the chances that your candidate is going to win. That's clearly not acceptable. It may or may not be legal. I'm not a legal expert, but it's clearly unethical. In most of the rest of the world, the political district it corresponds with the demographic districts and with the administrative district. If I live in New York, I vote for people who are actually politicians who are operating in New York. End of story. Most of the world works that way, but here things are have been out of control in that sense for a long time. But now it's getting to the point where not only there is extreme gerrymandering, but there is also this extraordinary step of a president who, remember, even though, of course, he's a member of a party, he's supposed to represent every American, right? He's supposed to be super partis, so to speak, right? Above the parts once he's elected. He's definitely acting, on the other hand, in a partisan way. He's directly instructing his people at a state level to essentially rig the next election. And how anybody can look at that kind of thing and say, oh, yeah, this is a healthy democracy, I don't know. So that is the first step, is that try to step back for a second and figure out exactly what it is that's going on. Open your eyes. One of the philosophers, pre-Socratic philosophers, that was a major influence on the Stoics was a guy named Heraclitus. And Heraclitus, who is most famous for having said that you never step into the same river twice, because everything changes all the time, so the river is never the same. In fact, you are not the same. But he also is famous for having told his fellow citizens in Ephesus, which is in modern Western Turkey, don't sleepwalk through life. Pay attention to what's going on. And most of you are just sleepwalking. So it seems to me that a lot of people still today, despite the fact that we are flooded with news and information and facts and counterfacts and stuff like that, most of us are still sleepwalking, because we don't pay attention to the right things. We get distracted constantly. We're like these dogs that get distracted every time that a squirrel goes by. The current administration is very good at these kind of things. They throw distractions every day. And journalists fall for it. So if journalists fall for this kind of thing, let alone the average American. So I think that the first step that a Stoic, in fact, would recommend is, okay, step back and employ your logos, employ your rationality, your ability to reason about things, and trying to figure out what exactly, to the best of your abilities, what exactly is going on here. Once you have that picture, then ask yourself, and what can I do here? Now, of course, I personally cannot change the entire system. I cannot affect the outcome of elections. I certainly cannot stop Trump or the Republicans from doing what they're doing, etc. But there is a number of things that I can do, right? Other than the obvious one, for instance, voting, which, by the way, it may be obvious to most of us, but in fact, in American election, typical American election, the turnout is about 50%, which means that half of the country doesn't even bother to come out and vote. So that would be the first thing to change, I would think. But you can vote, you can spend time volunteering for local organizations, you can influence local politicians, because the politicians in Washington are difficult to reach. Trust me, I tried. I tried several times to get in touch with the office of my senators and my representatives, and usually I get a low-level assistant who just says, the senator is too busy. But if you try to contact, for instance, your local representatives at the state level or even at the city level, you can get much further, and you can influence the outcome of elections. You can influence their policies and so on and so forth. You can talk to people. You can write to newspapers. You can send money to organizations. So there is lots of stuff. You can go into the streets and protest. There is all sorts of things that each one of us can do. And arguably, if more of us did, then we wouldn't be in this situation, or at least we had a much better chance of getting out of it.
This is all very good and fine. However,
But
the stresses well, there's always a but here when we're talking about these kind of deep and meaningful issues, right? But if we
right,
look at what you've just said, and then we go back to what you said about temperance, you see a lot of people not being able to handle the reality around them and then slipping into various addictions. You've got binge drinking, you've got drug taking, and you've got, porn online, you've got all kinds of other distractions that you can then disappear into in order to escape everything that you're seeing on the 24/7 news cycle, which you can't
right.
escape now because nowadays we're all carrying these bloody devices in our
That's right.
pockets. So it's
That's
not
right.
like, we used to have this notion about TV having changed the face of the world because we could see what was going on. We see things in glorious technicolor and it's in our pocket, not just in our lounge room. So there's no real escaping from all of this stuff. What do you say about temperance in terms of maintaining that degree of self-control when you're being overwhelmed by information from all sources?
One of the most interesting and most influential Stoic teachers of the first century, Musonius Rufus, used to say that you can practice temperance at all times, beginning every time you sit down for at the table to eat, right? So looking at the food that you eat, looking at what you drink, that's just one instance after another, one opportunity after another to practice temperance. I think that if Musonius were alive today, instead of using the example of food, he would say every time you get out your cell phone, that's an opportunity to exercise temperance. For instance, several years ago, I decided that social media overall was doing more, negative, more bad than good in society. So I got out of it. You can do that. Nobody is forcing anyone to be on X or on Facebook or anything like that, right? Now, of course, there is a cost to pay, right? When I announced to my family and friends that I was leaving Facebook, I got a lot of complaints, and in some cases, pretty loud complaints. But I explained my position. I explained why I arrived at that decision. Most people agreed or at least understood what I was doing. And my mental sanity has significantly improved ever since. Now, I like, as I said before, to keep in touch with the sort of the general situation of the world. So it's not like I cut off completely news, but I don't have any alerts on my phones. Right. So I have to look for something if I want to read what's going on. I don't get constantly buzzed by this thing that becomes a drug. And I'm not using the word metaphorically. There's research that shows that, in fact, it is addictive. It is literally an addictive kind of behavior, which, of course, tech companies know. And they are getting better and better at designing that software and that hardware in a way that it does become addictive. So those are all our decisions. I mean, nobody's actually forcing us to do that sort of stuff. There is a movement in the United States about pushing dumb phones, for instance. A return to phones they're not smart. They don't send you notifications all the time. Now, I haven't gone that far, but I admire that kind of attitude. Now, I could say, yeah, but that's going to cost me in terms of, as I said, friendships or relationship with other people. It's fine. But if you decide that is a good thing to do, that's where the practical wisdom comes in. That's where the courage comes in. Right? If you decided that is in fact a good thing to do, who is stopping you? But at the end of the day, we decide to keep engaging in these kind of behaviors. Nobody's forcing us.
Well, actually, I don't know. I'll take umbrage with that
Okay.
because I think if I understand my economics very well, there has been this little thing called the market and market forces. And
Yes.
market forces have created a society in which we develop co-relationships with our devices for life to move forward. So it makes it exceedingly difficult for me to sit back and say, this device that I've become so dependent on, I'm just going to put it to one side, or I'm going to switch off the notifications, like you say. I mean, that shows extreme discipline, Massimo, if you don't mind me saying. Most people will not have that discipline. Most people will buy into the advertiser's wet dream, which is, I've just created something, I've sold it to a bunch of people, I'm making a crap load of money, and people now are dependent on this object. This object now is something that no one can do without. In
Right.
fact, society really can't do without computers, can't do without AI generally, can't do without a bunch of other things that we've become dependent on over the
Right.
years. So, in actual fact, trying to say that no one is forcing us, maybe not so much directly, but certainly indirectly through the market, as the market develops these technologies moving forward, and we are
Right.
hungry for stuff and things that look nice. And we're very superficial as a
Right.
species. We like those
Yes, we are.
blinks, these
Yes,
blings
we
and
are.
blongs.
Right.
So
No,
so having
you're absolutely right. There are definitely major forces that push us in the opposite direction. What I suggest, however, is that none of this is mandatory, and the demonstration of this is that there are people who actually don't do it. Right? There are people who do turn off their notifications. There are people who don't belong to participate in social media. There are even people who don't have cell phones. Now, I'm not personally a Luddite. I'm talking to you through an iPad, and my
yeah.
iPhone is right over there. So it's not like um, I believe in a good use. Technology to me typically is, there are some exceptions, but typically technology is a neutral thing, meaning that it's not either moral or immoral or ethical or unethical. It's what you make of it. You can take a cell phone or a computer and do some really marvelous things with it, and then, or you can waste your life, or even do bad things with it. So it is up to you. But the very fact that there are people who are in fact capable, and we're not talking about 3 or 4 people, we're talking about a pretty decent number of people, although a minority for sure, who can do without it, they show us the way forward. And my point is, in this particular context, that if that's true, that is, if it is in fact psychologically and physically possible to either do without these things, or at the very least greatly diminish their impact, then at the end of the day, it's our own damn fault if we don't do it. And you can say, well, but it's an easier way for me to do it. Okay, but then it's your fault. Then don't complain, right? Then there is nothing that you can say. You shouldn't be in a position then to say, oh, the damn tech companies. Well, the tech
Yeah.
companies are doing what they're supposed to do. They're trying to make money out of it. You are complicit in allowing them to get money out of you in a way that you do not approve of. Therefore, don't expect the company. I mean, this whole notion, which is popular even, especially in the United States, of companies that self-regulate, right? That's nonsense. That's an oxymoron. A company will not self-regulate because a company is in the business of making money for its shareholders. That's what it is for. Not only in general terms, but legally. If a CEO, at least in the United States, if a CEO does something that actually undermines the profit of his shareholders, he's gonna go to jail. He's gonna go be in serious trouble. So do not expect the company to do things for you. What you need to do is to take responsibility and make your own decisions and make your priorities. And since we're talking about Stoicism, that's a lot of what Stoicism is about. It's about opening your eyes, don't sleepwalk through life, make decisions, and do your best to go through it. Now, as you, however, pointed out, we're all imperfect and fallible, right? None of us is a sage. And the Stoics recognize that. So you sleep up. Yes. You will do things that then you're going to regret, or you do things that are easy and so on and so forth. But then you stop yourself, you realize it, and you say, okay, let me try it again. Right? It is up to you. That is an issue of personal responsibility. Unlike, let's say, what the government does, that one is not up to you. You can contribute, and you should contribute to more or less healthy political life, but you don't control what other people do. You don't control certainly what large organizations like corporations or governments do. But by and large, you do control. You're in charge of your own decisions. You can. It's up to you. Sometimes it hurts. Yeah, I mean, it's the typical analogy that the ancient Stoics were making was with with exercising, or with going to the doctor, right? So you're in charge of your own willingness to do certain things. You're not in charge of the outcome, meaning that I can go to the doctor all I want. I can follow a healthy diet. I can exercise, etc., and then a little tiny virus is going to come in and kill me. That's true. So the outcome is not up to me, but deciding to actually get up off my couch and instead of watching TV, going to the gym or going for a walk or something, that is up to me. Few people do it. I know, and that's why we have a problem.
Okay, so Massimo, some say Stoicism is a luxury of the privileged. It doesn't overthrow dictators, it doesn't feed the hungry. How do you respond to critics who see Stoicism as a personal retreat from political and moral responsibility?
I would want to ask those people whether they would raise the same objection to, let's say, Buddhism or Christianity, because in my mind, there is really no difference at all. Christianity and Buddhism also don't overthrow tyrants by themselves. Christians and Buddhists do. And Stoics can as well overthrow tyrants through their actions. In fact, incidentally, historically, there has been a few examples of Stoics that have actually acted against tyrants. One of the most famous one was Cato the Younger, who literally took up arms against Julius Caesar. I mean, it wasn't just debating him on the Senate floor. Once that Caesar got up and got a legion and invaded the Roman Republic, Cato took up arms and fought a war. So this notion that Stoics are people who just lay back and do their own thing is actually historically incorrect. But I wonder, as I said, whether the same objection, these people would raise the same objection to things like Buddhism or Christianity. It's not a question of luxury; it's a question of focus and will. It's not easy. People often point out, and this is true. It's not easy to be a Stoic. The bar is pretty high, right? You're supposed to be practicing the 4 cardinal virtues in everything you do. You're supposed to constantly strive to become a better person, etc. But it's not easy to be a Buddhist either. To really accept and follow the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path to Enlightenment, that's not an easy thing. It's not easy to be a Christian. I mean, I am much more familiar with Christianity than with Buddhism. But if you want to be a good Christian, that doesn't mean you just talk about Jesus or raise your Bible and that's it. You're supposed to actually act like one every day, all day long. So is that a luxury? I don't think so. I don't think that Jesus would put it that way. It's a question, however, of priorities. That's true, right? So if Seneca, one of the Stoics, in one of his letters to his friend Lucilius, says, don't treat philosophy as the kind of thing you do at the end of the day once you're done everything else. You have to do it every day, all day. In everything that you do, you are supposed to act like a Stoic or a Christian or a Buddhist. You don't leave that for Sunday morning and that's it. Then you get out of church and you start doing bad things, because that's not being a Christian. That's just pretending to be or fooling yourself that you are.
Well, having been a lapsed Catholic, I understand the old story that, you go to church on the Sunday and then you start all over again the following week until you get absolved the next Sunday when
Exactly.
you go to church. So
isn't Catholicism great?
Oh, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful thing. It really is. Okay, Massimo, let's zoom out. We're seeing the erosion of international norms. Russia invades Ukraine, China flexes over Taiwan, Trump's tariffs, the UN is impotent. What would a Stoic approach to foreign policy look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it would be the same thing at a larger scale, right? It's not like the Stoics don't really have, they're not in the business of articulating, a foreign policy. Again, none any more than you would expect a Christian foreign policy or a Buddhist foreign policy. What you do have, these are philosophies of life. These are not, either national or international policy strategies. So what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to internalize and then apply the basic principles of that philosophy to whatever the situation is, whether it is treating people, interacting with people within your family or within your country or with the rest of the world. So what a Stoic would do is would do their best to favor within their own community and within their own country, to favor the kinds of policies that reflect Stoic principles. One of the most important Stoic principles is cosmopolitanism. This notion that, which doesn't mean you drink cosmopolitans all the time. It just means that, although that might be helpful at some point. So it means that you really try your best to regard every other human being on Earth, whether they are your neighbors or on the other side of the planet, as your brothers and sisters, right? Now, that's a nice idea in general. Well, at least I think it's a nice idea. Some people will tell you that it's not. But I think it's a nice idea. But it's not just an idea. It means that it does have consequences, including political consequences, right? So, for instance, as a Stoic, I am in favor of progressive reforms of immigration policies. Ideally, I'm actually in favor of a world where we're going to have no borders and no passports. Ideal. Now, I recognize that ideal cannot possibly be implemented tomorrow or even in 10 years or 20 years. I recognize, the notion of temperance allows me to recognize that you can't just snap your fingers and make the world that way, right? It is a process. And it is a process that may or may not, in the end, happen at some point. But that is my goal. I am in favor of a world where people can simply get up and walk everywhere or fly everywhere with no restrictions whatsoever. Now, that means, however, how do I get there? Well, that means that at the moment, in the here and now, I favor any kind of policy that is fair toward immigration, that it allows immigrations, of course, within certain parameters, of course, with a process, et cetera, because those things had to be in place if you want to do things in an orderly fashion that is fair to both the people that live in a place and to the people that want to go in it. But, I'm an immigrant myself, and I'm glad that I was allowed to immigrate, right? So whenever I see somebody else who wants to improve their lives or their family's lives and is willing to pick up and leave where the place where they grow up and their friends and family and all that to make it perhaps thousands of miles away, a lot of people, especially in the United States, unfortunately, seem to think that migrants do that because it's just about greed and I want to be rich and famous and powerful and all that sort of stuff. It takes a lot of courage and it's a lot of grief to be a migrant, because you're leaving your country, your culture, your friends, at least part of your family. This is a wrenching process. It's not even under ideal circumstances, and mine was ideal because I came in the United States 35 years ago. Legally, I applied for a visa, I was granted a visa for my studies, and then I stayed, et cetera, et cetera. So I did the whole process as it was supposed to be. Even so, I had to leave my parents behind. I had to leave my brothers and sister behind. I had to leave friends that I had known since I was a child. So this is no picnic. Too many people think that immigration is kind of a picnic. It's easy, the easy thing to do. It isn't. It's people do it only if they're desperate, or if they have, like in my case, I wasn't desperate, but in my case, I had a very specific kind of career that I wanted to pursue. And I knew that the best way to do it was to move to the United States. So we should never treat immigrants as, these are people who want it easy and they don't have any problem. They just come in and pretend things. They don't pretend anything. It's a really difficult thing to do. So to treat other people fairly, again, with dignity, with respect, as you would want to be treat it. It's a fundamental, I would say, not just Stoic, but I think it's a fundamental human ethical precept.
Okay, so if we applied Stoicism to the Israel-Gaza war, where do we land? What should Israeli citizens or soldiers do when they're caught between religion, fear, ideology, or military force? How should Palestinian Gazans and their international supporters react to what looks increasingly like a genocide?
Mm. So we're going to go for the easy targets here, huh? Okay. So
Of course, that's why I brought you on the show.
that's right. Look, as you know, the situation, the current situation is horrible. And I'm sorry, this is going to make me unpopular with part of your audience, but at this particular moment, I blame the Israeli government, not Jews in general, but the Israeli government. It's handling things in a really horrible way. That said, as you know, also that conflict has been going on for a long time, not just in modern times. It's been on, that piece of land has been disputed for literally thousands of years, which means that it's complicated because everyone that lives in that area has pretty reasonable claims to the notion that that is their land. And of course, the rational thing to do would simply be, well, okay, then divide it up. If there are 2 or 3 or 4 different kinds of groups of people, all of them with historical claims to that place, then just divide it up. But of course, that would be too rational to do, and it's not going to happen. Quite frankly, other than the immediate situation, for which, as I said, I squarely blame the Israeli government and its current policies. But historically, I think the agent, the participant that is most to blame is the United States. The United States, with very few and even those partial exceptions, has never been a honest broker in the peace process. And the United States does have the means to broker a good peace process there because they have the power. Because all sides essentially depend, especially Israel depend on the goodwill of the United States. It is the United States that has been selling weapons, for instance, to Israel. It's the United States that has its own interests politically, territorially, et cetera, et cetera. And if they actually started acting as an honest broker, together probably, I would say, with the EU, because the EU is right there, it's nearby, it's a neighbor. If those two entities, but especially the United States, really wanted to have a settlement, the settlement will happen. But of course, especially now, given the current climate in the US, that's just not going to happen. So right now, it's just an ongoing tragedy, and it remains to be seen just how far it's going to go. What would a Stoic do? Again, try to figure out what the situation is, try to your best to understand the world. The Stoics always thought that the best thing to do is, first and foremost, to try to understand what's going on. Because if you don't understand what's going on, then you have no idea of what you can do and which direction you need to act. And then do whatever you can, which, none of us individually can go there and force a solution to the problem. But we can do our part. We can push our representatives, for instance, here in the United States or in Europe, in a certain direction. We can vote for certain people and policies rather than others. We can send money to organizations that are aiding the situation there. There's all sorts of things that we can do without necessarily going all the way to, okay, I'm volunteering and I'm for Doctors Without Borders and I'm going to go to Gaza. That's fine too, if you want to go that far. But most of us don't and can't. That doesn't mean that we cannot do anything. One thing that I wouldn't do is to obsessively check the news, because that's not going to help. That's only going to make you feel much worse.
But Massimo, if I could just pick you up on this. All right, you've covered off on the US, you've covered off on Israel, and that's great. But then the last part of the question was really about, well, what would a Stoic's response be if you were on the ground in Gaza as a Palestinian? How would they respond to the kind of punishment the Israeli government is meting out to them? What is their correct response, and what would be response you would expect from the international community, especially those who kind of now are starting to come out in favor of the Palestinians? I wouldn't say that they're in favor of Hamas, but certainly they're not in
No,
favor
no,
of what the
right,
Israeli government is doing. So what's the logic here for
right, right.
Stoicism in this fraught situation?
Well, first of all, I'm glad you made that distinction. Hamas is not the same as the Palestinians, just like the current Israeli government is not the same as Jews in general, or even Israelis in general.
Yeah.
So those distinctions are important. Look, I think the answer for a Stoic is always going to be the same, regardless of where you are and how dire the situation is. The first question you ask yourself is, what is it that here and now is up to me? What is it? What is my agency? What can my agency actually affect under these conditions? And sometimes the answer is not much. And you have to accept it because you don't control the situations. You don't control the background conditions. But there is always something you can do. Even if you are in really dire situation, you can still be helpful to your neighbors. You can still be helpful to your family. You can still comfort them physically or psychologically and so on. So there's always something that we can do for other people. Seneca, again, at one point says, look, if you're in charge of an empire, there is much you can do. But even if you are retired and living in your home, there's still much you can do, just at a different scale, at a very different scale. So for the Stoic, the important thing is, first of all, ask yourself, what is it here and now that I can actually be efficacious in doing? And second of all, whatever the answer to that question is, make sure that it is informed by Stoic principles. That is, make sure that it is just, courageous, temperate, and practically wise is really not, that doesn't roll off your tongue, but
Yeah.
that's unfortunately the name of that particular virtue. So in other words, it is virtuous in general, right? According to the Stoic principle. So you always want to act with the recognition, of course, that you're in charge of your decisions, not of the outcomes of those actions. Right? I can decide to do this or that or the other, but I don't control. I have no control whether those decisions are actually going to achieve what I want or not. And I need to be okay with it from the get-go. One of the most important parts of Stoic training is this acceptance from the beginning, which is often, unfortunately, mistaken for passivity. But it's not passivity. It's the notion that I'm going to try to do my best, but I know that I may not succeed, and I need to be okay with the notion that I may not succeed, because that's just the way the world works. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. Sometimes you're efficacious, and other times you're not.
Does this also, come across with the following question? So, what I've got is that the West has condemned Russia's bombing of civilians in Ukraine, but it seems more muted about Israel's actions in Gaza. Does Stoicism
Yeah.
help us navigate this moral inconsistency, or does it only offer us detachment?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, as far as the Stoics, because the Stoics are cosmopolitan, as far as the Stoic is concerned, it doesn't matter who is being oppressed or who is being attacked. You should have the same response, no matter what. They're human beings. It really matters not at all from a Stoic perspective, whether they are Palestinians, Ukrainians, or whatever in any other part of the world. I mean, ideally, the Stoic response is always the same. Somebody is being oppressed or is being subject to violence. That's not right. That's not just. And so I'm going to try to do whatever I can in order to address the situation. So you're absolutely right that these the unequal treatment and unequal response that we have in these situations is certainly not in line with Stoic principles. And that's one of the reasons I think the practice of Stoicism would actually make this a little better world, because you would really internalize the notion that there are no more important or less important people. People are people. And it doesn't matter who they are, where they are. If there is an injustice, then it is up to the rest of us to try to do something about it.
You're listening to The Focus with me, John Bruni, and my guest, Professor Massimo Pigliucci. If you're enjoying this conversation, don't forget to follow, share, and leave a review on your podcast platform of choice. Now back to the show. Let's talk Trump. There are a couple of things I want to raise about
Sure.
Trump. Okay. So let's go down this hypothetical rabbit warren, if you will. Imagine Trump being a Stoic. I was waiting for that. Okay. Imagine Trump being a Stoic, and he had to then sit across the table from Vladimir Putin, who is known to make sure that he will do whatever he needs to do to defend Russia's national interest, including lie directly to the face of the US president.
Right.
What could a hypothetical Stoic Trump do in order to get Putin to understand that maybe peace is worth a go here? I mean, how does that work? I mean, if you have a Stoic leader of the most powerful republic in the world, and he has to try to hem in an ongoing war with a man who's, also very judicious with his capacity for truth.
Right.
How do you navigate that?
I like the way you put it. Very judicious with truth. So these hypothetical, and we're talking seriously hypothetical Stoic Trump at this point, because there's really nothing. There's very few people I can think of that are less Stoic than Donald Trump. But let's go with the thought experiment for a minute, right? So again, first of all, you want to check your moral compass. The Stoic moral compass, again, is the 4 cardinal virtues. So anything you do, you ask yourself, am I in an alignment with the cardinal virtues, right? And the second thing to remember is that Stoics are not pacifists. They don't advocate the use of violence unless it is absolutely strictly necessary, but they're not pacifists. And so if you are in a situation where you have to threaten action, including military action, then you have to do it. But of course, with temperance, following the principles of justice, et cetera, right? So it's with people like Putin, I think it's the carrot and stick situation, which is, well understood and well tested strategy. You have to figure out which particular carrots and or sticks and combination thereof might work with that person. That may require, first of all, doing your homework and trying to learn as much as possible about the other person, about the geopolitical situation, et cetera, which is of course something that current Trump would never do because he thinks he knows better no matter what. But a wise Stoic president would first of all rely on the best available information and the best advisors in terms of understanding what the situation is and what lines of least resistance one can go after in order to try to affect a change. Also, the hypothetical Stoic Trump would definitely work with allies because Stoicism is about cooperation. Stoicism is about this notion that human beings work best when they work together, when they work rationally, when they try to act in a rational fashion, but also cooperatively, pro-socially. So you try to get as many people on board as possible in whatever combination may be suitable to the specifics of the situation. Now, what I'm telling you is nothing really particularly outside of what I think a good strategist or a good statesman would do, or a good diplomat would do. And we have examples in history of good diplomats who have actually been successful because of that, and who have not shied necessarily away from the use of force, but only again as the last resort, and only within certain certain bounds. The problem with most of the leadership of the world right now is that not only they're not Stoics. I can't think of a single major world leader who would fit the profile of a Stoic, but they're in fact either a bunch of cowards or a bunch of narcissists interested only in self-aggrandizing. So that's bad. That's a horrible situation. I think, of course, of Trump as a narcissist, self-aggrandizer. I think of most of the current leaders of Europe as cowards, quite frankly. Europe doesn't seem to realize that it is a powerful entity on the world stage. Not individual European countries, but the European Union as a whole, which I understand it's not a political union yet, although it could have been if they got their act together 20 years ago, 25 years ago. They tried, and they did try to pass twice, I think, to pass a European constitution, so to make the European Union into a political union, not just an economic union. But even at an economic level, they are one of the major players in the world. I mean, they are at the same level, economically speaking, in terms of number of people as China or the United States. But they need to get their act together. They need to grow up and take seriously this notion that they are in fact a player. They can't just pretend to be a player, but then when it comes to actually playing with the big guys, just no, I'm not going to do this. I'm gonna step back. So the unfortunate situation, I think, at the moment is that we are in perilous times, and I don't see any good leadership anywhere. I couldn't name you a single major, political leader that I would say, that I would point to and say, I can't name right now a Churchill or a Roosevelt or anything like that. Of course, often you can do that only after the fact with the hindsight. So I hope that I'm wrong. I hope that actually one or more of these leaders is actually out there and they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, and we will recognize it only 20 years down the road. But frankly, at the moment, I'm not optimistic.
Okay, thanks, Massimo. But that confirms what I already know about the political system. There is no leadership.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, with regard to Trump, we've got the other thing, and that is, of course, there's a corrosion of truth in the United States. There's the rise of anger politics. I mean, what does Stoic do when an entire political system seems seduced by spectacle? And could you take us on a bit of a historic journey? Because I'm sure at some time in our past, our distant past, when the original Stoics were still kicking around, they must have come across people like what we're seeing now.
Oh, yeah.
So how do they deal with stuff like this?
Oh, yeah. Most of the ancient Stoics lived either during the Roman Republic, which was one of the two ancient democracies in the world, right? Athens was one, and the Roman Republic was another one. And in fact, we tend to think of Athens as the original democracy, but the two started as literally at the same time, like a year after the other. In fact, Republican Rome was established 1 year before democratic Athens. And if anything, it was Republican Rome that offered a model that is more similar to what we today think of as a democracy, because it had representative. It was a representative democracy. It had checks and balances, constitutional, more or less constitutional checks and balances. Athens did not. Athens was essentially a majority rule kind of democratic system. It was a straightforward, direct democracy. So the Stoics lived both under the Roman Republic and then, of course, the Empire. And in the Empire, they lived under good emperors. Marcus Aurelius, who was himself a Stoic. Adrian was a pretty good emperor. Antoninus Pius was a pretty good emperor, and pretty awful emperors: Nero, Vespasian, Domitian, and so on and so forth. And they acted accordingly. So, first of all, let me step back for a second. For a Stoic, the form of government is what they call a indifferent, which can be preferred or dispreferred. Indifferent doesn't mean you don't care, you don't give a crap about it. It just means that literally it does not make a difference to what? To my own practice of virtue, right? So I can be a good Stoic regardless of the political system under which I'm living. Again, the analogy here, if this sounds strange, the analogy is with a Buddhist or a Christian. A Christian can live in a dictatorship or in a democracy. Of course, it prefers to live in a democracy, presumably, rather than a dictatorship. But a Christian can be a good Christian even under a tyranny. And the same goes for a Stoic. There is a preference, of course, certainly among modern Stoics, for a democratic system of government, checks and balances, and all that sort of stuff. But a Stoic can be a good Stoic regardless of the government, the system of government under which he happens to live. Also, I mentioned already before, when the Stoics were faced with tyranny, not just Julius Caesar during the Republic, but later on, three of the emperors that I just mentioned, Nero, Vespasian, and Domitian, they took up arms. They were clearly in opposition. I mean, there was a group of senators and philosophers during those three, during the reigns of those three emperors, who are referred to today as the Stoic opposition. These are people who actually had the courage to go straight to the emperor and say, no, I don't think so. I don't think this is the right thing to do. Several of them lost their lives as a result. So this is not, it takes courage to act in a just fashion. We know some of their names because these are reported in the chronicles. So some of them opposed the emperors on the floor of the Senate, which is what a good politician would do today, right? So the United States right now is sliding into autocracy, arguably. And there are some people who are literally taking to the floor of the Senate to speak out against what is happening. They are acting exactly as the Stoic opposition was acting 2 millennia ago. Now, I certainly hope that it's not going to come to an armed conflict, because that, as I said, first of all, it's always unpredictable how those kind of things are going to end, and it's always sad because somebody's always going to die as a result of that sort of resort. But at the same time, look at the history of humanity. Sometimes the only thing that it's left to do it's that one, it's to take up arms. The American Republic started out that way, right? It picked up arms.
Can I just say something? I mean, you raise a very interesting point, and since we're talking about history now, have we lost something along the way in terms of the ability to sacrifice oneself for the greater good? I mean, this used to be the thing that got us to where we were prior to the rise of autocracies, where people of principle would stand up against those who would, give us the autocratic spiel and say no, even though they know they are going to be hauled off to prison, tortured, and killed, they would still do that in order to maintain society in a good way. There are none of these people. There is no courage in the body politic anymore from my perspective. When I see how we're easily sliding into this autocratic mindset, and no one's even sitting back saying, oh, hang on a tick, didn't we fight a couple of world wars to make sure that there was at least a part of the world that was safe for democracy and those kind of good things that we had gotten used to for all this period of time? What accounts for the laziness in thinking and the cowardice that is so prevalent in modern society today?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, I would push back a little bit on the premise of that question. I am not convinced that the current situation is qualitatively different from the past. At a quantitative level, perhaps, that's always hard to judge. But there's always been a lot of cowards out there. There's always been a lot of people who prefer to go on with their lives without doing anything, even under fairly. I mean, after all, I'm Italian, and a lot of Italians looked the other way when Mussolini was rising to power. Germans voted Hitler twice into office. So it's not like this kind of thing has not happened before. What it is that with history, we have the advantage, of course, of hindsight, right? So we have the advantage of then looking at what happened afterwards, and we see certain people that initially may have not, in fact, reacted, or that were not as loud or as obvious as one might want to, and then in the end, however, they did make a difference. So perhaps we're actually witnessing yet another example of this same kind of thing. I mean, after all, we do have a number of politicians here in the United States who have been very vocal. A number of journalists who have been vocal. A lot of comedians who have been very vocal about criticizing administration. It's not like there is complete silence. It's not like there is a dearth of responses, but these responses have been ineffective so far. But that's a different issue, right? So why are the responses ineffective as opposed to why are there no responses? Those are two different things. The ineffectiveness of a response depends on a number of things. For one thing, the Democrats have been in disarray for a long time. They have never been particularly efficacious over the last several years. They did manage to get a couple of presidents elected. Obama got elected twice, and Biden, of course. So perhaps at some point they thought there was no need to be particularly assertive or particularly, okay, it's one thing, and this time we win, next time they win. Well, but now, however, we are in a situation where, as we were saying at the beginning of this conversation, there are extraordinary things going on. There is a president who is openly advocating cheating during the next round of elections. And things are beginning to happen. As we speak, all 51, as far as I know, all 51 of the Democrats in the Texas House have left the state, and in order to block these gerrymandering that the Republicans are trying to do. That takes courage. Trump is sending the FBI after them. They risk arrest, although arguably illegally, because they're not actually violating any law by leaving Texas. But nevertheless, these are people who are now speaking out. So I think that the issue is most people tend to assume, and historically rightly so, that whatever is happening now, it's not an exception. Things are not gonna get that bad, and so on and so forth. So there is always a lag before the reaction comes in. Before the Italians started the resistance against Mussolini, or before even the rest of the European nations started realizing what was happening with Hitler, it took time. And initially, that gave the advantage, of course, to the autocrats, because they caught people by surprise, right? I mean, the famous appeasement by the UK was because Hitler was seen initially as, yeah, sure, he's a little out of line compared to most politicians, but he's certainly not going to invade Poland, is he? And then he did, and then at some point, the reaction started. Now, you could argue, of course, that we should learn from history and be more attentive and more preemptive about these kind of things, rather than always lag behind. But unfortunately, things are the way they are. So I think that, I guess, even though I, generally speaking, am pessimistic about the current situation of the world, I'm not as pessimist as saying that there isn't going to be a reaction. The reaction is going to be there, and there will be people who will rise to the occasion. Whether they'll be effective or not, that's a different issue. I mean, it took 20 years to bring down Mussolini. It wasn't something that happened overnight, right? Yeah, and it took a war to bring him down. So, there is a price to pay for these kinds of things. But I think there will be people that will rise to the occasion.
In an age where everything is politicized, Massimo, gender, war, language, even facts, how does one pursue a life of virtue without being shouted down, cancelled, or co-opted?
Well, as a Stoic, if you are canceled, that's somebody else's problem, not yours, right? It's you don't control other people's behaviors. So now, that said, however, you also want to make sure that you're canceled for the right reasons. That is, did you do your homework? Did you actually understand the issues, or did you just go off and shoot out your mouth out of ignorance? So one of the fundamental virtues, other than the 4 cardinal virtues that I already mentioned, which are the ethical virtues, but the Stoics recognize 2 other virtues. One is the ability to understand facts, that is, to practice knowledge, to acquire knowledge, and the other one is the ability to think rationally about those facts. And those 2 are, we don't think of them necessarily today as virtues, but they are, and they're fundamental. They are very important, because too many people these days just don't do their homework. They don't make an effort to really understand and think critically about things. It's increasingly difficult. I have to say, because social media certainly doesn't make it easy. And now AI, it's going to make it even more difficult because it's so easy to manipulate now information. It's so easy to produce. I mean, I was just reading today an article about China using AI to spread misinformation and and fake news. So there you have it, and that's a whole different level that it's going to make it increasingly difficult for the rest of us to actually navigate things. If I may, I'm going to mention one of the ironies of the current situation in the United States is that for the first time in a long time, I actually feel myself the way in which the other side has told us that they felt for a long time. So one of the standard complaints from the MAGA world has been that they cannot trust the government because the government is run by a bunch of nefarious individuals. They lie all the time, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, up until recently, my response was, well, people lies and people make mistakes, but no, overall, I'm actually pretty confident that if, let's say, the Center for Disease Control says something, it's probably their honest best guess. If the Bureau of Statistics gives me numbers about unemployment, they're probably the best numbers they can come up with. But now I feel exactly like MAGA has told us they felt for a long time. That is, I just can't trust the government. I don't trust anything that it comes out at this point of Trump's mouth or Vance or RFK Jr. or any of these people. It's just I have absolutely no trust into the entire process. That's a really bad situation. On what basis I'm going to make decisions, including personal decisions, vaccinate, not vaccinate. Is there even going to be a vaccine available for, the next season is coming, the flu season is coming up, and I am almost due for a new booster shot for COVID. They might not even be available at this point. Yeah. So it's really sad. It's really worrisome.
Okay, so Massimo, honestly, let's pivot now onto something more internal to Stoicism itself, its popular reinterpretation. Modern Stoicism is undergoing a strange cultural mutation. It's being co-opted, some would say perverted by online influencers. Figures like Joe Rogan, Andrew Tate, and Elon Musk often reference Stoic themes like control, toughness, and detachment, but what they describe looks more like dominance, wealth accumulation, and ego. What do you make of this phenomenon called Broicism?
Yeah. I call them out as much as I can. Unfortunately, Stoicism is not, again, it's not the exception. There are perversions of other philosophies and religions out there. I mean, in the United States, for instance, there is a perversion of Christianity called the prosperity gospel, which is this notion that, as a Christian, your duty is to make a lot of money because, and in fact, it's a sign of the fact that God favors you if you become rich. That's nonsense from a Christian perspective. Just in the same way in which Elon Musk or Joe Rogan or Jeff Bezos going around that saying that they can use Stoic techniques to become rich and famous, that's also nonsense because that's not what Stoicism is about. You can use techniques for all sorts of things, right? Techniques are just tools. Yeah. One analogy here is with meditations in Buddhism, right? We often think of Buddhism immediately associated with the notion of meditation, but in fact, most Buddhists don't meditate, and just because you meditate, that doesn't mean you're a Buddhist. You are a Buddhist if you accept the Four Noble Truths, or if you try to follow the Eightfold Path toward enlightenment. Then you're a Buddhist. Whether you meditate or not doesn't make any difference. Now, that said, it is well known that meditation does help with certain things. It does calm you down. It does help you, dealing with thoughts of depression, anxiety, and so on and so forth. So why not? If people can use it as a tool. The same exact thing goes for Stoic tools. So it is certainly the case that different kinds of Stoic techniques, such as these focus on what is up to you and acceptance of what is not up to you, such as the evening meditation journaling, so that you try to figure out what is it that you did during the day that worked or didn't work, and so on and so forth. Those, not every Stoic does them, and certainly non-Stoics can use them with proficiency. I mean, after all, Stoicism did inspire the birth of cognitive behavioral therapy back in the late 1950s and early 60s. And cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is one of the most effective evidence-based type of therapy. But just because you go to a CBT practitioner, it doesn't mean you're now embracing Stoicism. It just means that you're using certain techniques that are empirically known to work. So I'm only in favor of people using techniques such as meditations or the Stoic ones for whatever problems they might have. If it is depression, if it is anxiety, et cetera, or anger management, and so on and so forth. You can read Seneca's On Anger, for instance, and you can compare it with what the American Psychological Association says about anger management, and you'll find that they're essentially the same. They're very, very similar type of advice, the same kind of techniques that Seneca was suggesting 2,000 years ago are essentially the same ones that the APA provides today. But that doesn't make you a Stoic. It just makes you somebody who is trying to deal with anger in a certain way. So the problem with the perversion, of course, is that then people start thinking that the point of Stoicism, the major point of Stoicism, is in fact to become rich and famous and so on and so forth. While in fact, in a sense, it is the opposite, because reputation, fame, wealth, and so on and so forth, those are all indifferent as far as the Stoics are concerned. That is, these are things that have value, because certainly, your life is going to be easier if you have a little bit of money rather than if you don't. But they do not have anything to do with your character, which is the only thing that Stoicism is concerned about. The discourses of Epictetus begin with an exchange between Epictetus and one of his students, and one of his students says, isn't gold a good thing? Shouldn't I go and get some gold? And Epictetus says, well, no, gold is a thing. Whether it's good or not depends on how you use it. And gold itself isn't going to tell you how to use it. What tells you how to use it is your brain, your prohairesis, your faculty of judgment, right? So that's what you want to work on, not accumulating gold. Because if you're accumulating gold and then you behave like Elon Musk, you're doing much worse, in the world than, much. You're not improving the world. You're making the world into a worse place. So the important thing is to improve yourself as a human being. Whether then you happen to be wealthy or not, it's a secondary matter as far as the Stoics are concerned.
Massimo, despite everything, the wars, the fecklessness, the exhaustion, you continue to teach, write, and advocate for rational virtue. What gives you hope, Massimo? What gives you hope?
Low expectations.
Well said.
So, when I was younger, I thought one of the first things that I read when I was in college was a book that it's still around. I think it's in the 3rd or 4th edition. It's called What is This Thing Called Science? And it's by an Australian philosopher, Alan Chalmers. And it's a wonderful book about the nature of science. I learned a lot about science and philosophy reading it. But I still remember the edition that I had in college started out with an epigraph, and the sentence said, "I set out to be a genius, but mercifully laughter intervened." And that's my self-imposed attitude. I set out thinking I can change the world, perhaps. If I change one mind at a time, that's good enough. It's worth the time. If I can make some people's lives better, and apparently I do, because people write to me who have read my books, or who read my writings, or listen to podcasts and interviews where I am, and they tell me that this is helpful. And frankly, what else can I possibly want? I mean,
Yeah.
If I spend, my life doing something that I personally enjoy and helps other people, that's it. Then the rest of the world will do what the rest of the world does.
Massimo Pigliucci, thank you for joining us and for sharing your insights on the focus.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We'll link to our previous conversations with Massimo in the show notes. It's been a powerful conversation, but perhaps those are the most necessary, especially during these troubling times. If you want to explore more of Massimo's work, check out his books like my favorite, How to Be a Stoic, and a handbook for new Stoics, How to Thrive in a World Out of Your Control, and follow his writings on his socials, if he still has any. Anyway, and for our listeners, if this conversation challenged you, I think we've done our job. My thanks as always to producer of The Focus, Neil Smart. Until next time, from Adelaide, South Australia, thanks for tuning in to The Focus.